This story right here is going to be my article of reference because it does kind of sum everything up pretty well. And then I've got a few things I want to mention after. So the Time posts this in their article. The Second Amendment will soon take center stage in the Supreme Court again, as the justices are set to weigh cannabis users' right to bear arms. The president has positioned himself as a vocal defender of the amendment, at one point referring to himself as, quote, most pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment president you've ever had in the White House, end quote. But in United States versus Hamani, which the Supreme Court will hear arguments over sometime early next year following a request from the Trump administration, his Justice Department will argue in favor of restrictions on gun ownership. The case was brought by a Texas man who was once prosecuted for violating a federal statute that bars people who use illegal drugs from gun possession. Attorneys representing the man argued that the ban was unconstitutional in its application. Both a district judge and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in his favor. They actually ruled that his possession of cannabis or use of cannabis when he was not using the firearm does not constitute imposing restrictions on his rights to bear firearms. So the key is that they didn't have a clear indicator as to when his rights or his use of cannabis, happened and when the firearm usage occurred. The Department of Justice, in its June request for the Supreme Court to hear the case, called the right to bear arms a, quote, fundamental right that is essential to ordered liberty, end quote, and acknowledged that restrictions on the right possessed a threat to freedoms. But the agency added there are narrow circumstances in which the government may justifiably burden that right. The case will affect millions of people. Each year, more than 50 million American adults report using cannabis, the most popular drug in America, quote, end quote, according to the National Center of Drug Abuse Statistics. And around a third of Americans say they personally own a gun, the Pew Research Center reports, though it's unclear on how much overlap there is between the two groups. What is this particular case about? Ali Daniel Hamani, a Texas man, was found to be in possession of a Glock 9mm pistol, around 60 grams of marijuana, and 4.7 grams of cocaine after FBI agents searched his home in 2022. Federal prosecutors then charged Hamani with violating a federal law that prohibits firearm possession by individuals who are, quote, unlawful users of or addicted to any controlled substance, end quote. The federal statute is enforceable even in the nearly 40 states that allow for medical cannabis use and 24 that allow for recreational use, says Eric Rubin, professor of the SMU Deadman School of Law and a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. Essentially what you have here, and I want to caveat this entire story because I want to separate the Hamani, the case itself, from the fundamental argument of whether your right to bear arms should be infringed upon your use of cannabis. Because I don't know the full story of this Hamani guy, but I don't want him. I got a feeling that there's a lot more shady shit going on with him, and I could be wrong. However, the FBI was investigating him because of his communications and travel to Iran and overseas. So there might be some underlying story that affects this Hamani guy that may or may not be just, if you will. So I'm not going to say I support Hamani or his case or anything in one way or another. I just merely want to focus on the sheer principle of the case, of the fact that even though he was in possession of cocaine as well as cannabis, the focus right now is primarily on the use of cannabis. because of the conversation rescheduling cannabis at a federal level. So there is a cocaine aspect to this as well that is, in my opinion, a little more heinous or a little more unlawful than the cannabis aspect. And the majority of people are only focusing on the cannabis aspect because of the conversation circling around rescheduling, because cannabis is a Schedule 1. So that's where I want to keep the conversation. I think it's interesting that we're having the conversation of whether or not the use of cannabis is what's triggering somebody's infringement upon their right to bear arms, when we haven't had this conversation around alcohol or prescription drugs, the opioid addiction pandemic, if you will, epidemic that's taking over is absurd. But that's not really the point of the conversation. It's cannabis, which I think is very interesting. I watched a video from Colion Noir, and without essentially plagiarizing everything he said, I want to highlight the key moments that he mentions in his video. This is an American man who is pro Second Amendment, and he brings up some very, very important points.
Let me get this straight. The same government that lets you buy whiskey by the gallon, prescription by the bottle, and antidepressants like candy is now saying marijuana turns you to a public safety threat. This case, United States v. Hamani, is about a Texas man charged under 18 USC 922G3 for owning a gun while being what they call an unlawful user of a controlled substance. And I want to quote this verbatim. Hamani's indictment followed a Bureau of Investigation search of his home, where agents found a 9mm pistol, about 60 grams of marijuana, and roughly 4.7 grams of cocaine. He had admitted to use of those substances. He moved to dismiss the indictment, arguing that his Second Amendment rights were infringed because the statute failed to define when drug use triggers the firearm prohibition. That right there, failed to define when drug use triggers firearm prohibition, that's the problem. Because laws like this don't protect people, they trap them. They give the government room to decide when your rights suddenly disappear. The Fifth Circuit Court actually got it right when they ruled that 922G3 couldn't be applied to someone who was sober during the firearm possession. Translation: if you're not high while holding the gun, the government doesn't get to pretend you are. But now the Justice Department wants the Supreme Court to bring that law back. And in doing so, they're asking the court to define when freedom ends and judgment begins. Here's the irony. Marijuana is legal, either medically or recreationally, in a lot of states. So we're not talking about outlaws. We're talking about citizens following their state laws who suddenly become federal criminals because Washington refuses to update its definition of reality. And this is where the real danger is. Once the government can strip your rights based on behavioral judgment, they don't stop at marijuana. They'll move to prescription meds, mental health diagnosis, political affiliation, whatever fits the narrative of public safety. Because when public safety becomes the justification, freedom becomes the casualty. The Second Amendment was never about perfect people. If it were, the founders would have disarmed half the taverns in colonial America. They didn't. They didn't say you can bear arms unless you've had too much rum or grow hemp. They understood that rights are a safeguard because people are imperfect, not a reward for being flawless. That's what the government doesn't get. They keep treating freedom like a security clearance, something you can lose if you don't meet their moral standards.
Shout out to Colion. I appreciate his input. I heard a lot of different arguments in regards to the situation in the case, and he makes a few good points in regards to the first point about the states. Cannabis is already legal in 40 plus states, and medically, as we read, and 20 plus recreationally. So this isn't a case that's focusing on criminal use or criminals in general. This is regular citizens that we're talking about that just so happen to use cannabis. The second point that he makes is that this is just the start. I think it's interesting that we start at cannabis. And I often hear the argument that when people are like, well, when we're legalizing cannabis, shouldn't we look at other things we've legalized, like alcohol and tobacco, and then start with a higher safeguard? My answer is no, just do it smarter. And so when we see cannabis legalization approaching some form of movement, cannabis legalization on a federal level, they're going to throw something like this in there that'll be a Trojan horse to farther and more restrictive infringements upon our rights. The government has zero reason to be involved in cannabis. We have a hard enough time trying to regulate the other aspects of mental illness, of alcohol use, of fatherless homes. We have a ton of different issues that lead to other problems that we should be focusing on first. It has nothing to do with the use of cannabis. And I think, if anything, each case could be determined on a case-by-case basis, right? Your rights shouldn't be infringed. However, if you're going to act negligible and or criminal, some of your rights are going to change. And that's really just the way it is, right? If you get into a vehicle and you decide to drink and you mow through an intersection and you kill a family, you are responsible for that, okay? You are responsible for that. You are responsible for the decisions you made. And I think that's important, that no matter what happens, if you are intoxicated or inebriated from the use of cannabis and you do something stupid, criminal, heinous, you should be responsible for that. But not every citizen should be infringed upon in order to put a blanket solution on macro problems. I think it's very important that we do not give any kind of leniency to this case in anything other than cannabis use should not immediately mean that you are not entitled to your rights as an American citizen. There was a point in which I also wanted to mention, because this is a multifaceted conversation, because as right now, at the very same time, we are seeing the conversation of the possibility of rescheduling cannabis from a Schedule 1, essentially making it not even enforceable through law enforcement. We're going to see that reschedule happening, essentially a form of legalization, or at least maybe even maybe legalization isn't the word, but legislation, regulation. But then on this side, it's also going to say that because cannabis use is illegal, someone is unable to utilize their rights. Someone who puts this into a really better argument than I do is Shad Dales from the Dales Report. And he ties this in to rescheduling very well. And shout out to Shad. He's doing his shit over there on the Dales Report. Very insightful. So listen to this.
Let's now look at this from a legal angle first. If cannabis is indeed rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it's no longer considered an illegal drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Checkmark, we know that. But here's why I bring that up. That would directly undermine the DOJ's argument in this gun rights case, because the entire basis for banning marijuana users from owning firearms is that cannabis is federally illegal. So look at this a little bit further. If the DOJ were to defend that ban in court while simultaneously rescheduling cannabis, then they'd be contradicting themselves, wouldn't they? So that's a legal mess, and it's likely why they're asking for more time, to avoid ruling on an outdated law while major policy shift is in motion. But there's also a political layer here. Let's be real, rescheduling, it isn't just
and essentially he does, and shout out to Shad, he brings up another great point in regards to the political aspect, in regards to asking for more time to prolong not only the case, but the rescheduling as a whole, this now again becomes another election hot topic where they can say, oh, we're going to move on rescheduling, vote for us, da 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 da. So of course, be very cautious when you hear cannabis legalization coming from your politicians. This is a very complex argument, hot topic, and a very personal topic to a lot of people, and I want to hear from you.